Hi, I'm Adam Ornelas, and I'm going to be your TA for Intro to Geology lab this semester. So today we're going to go over the syllabus and how the class is going to work and what's expected of you. And then we're going to have a bit of a lecture, pretty short, on what a mineral is and how to identify them, which will be important because you're going to be quizzed on that. And that's also what the entire next week's lab is going to be based on, so make sure you stick around for that. So, I guess getting into the syllabus, the way class is going to work is you're going to get a video at 9 a.m. the day of your lab, and that's going to explain how the lab works, kind of like this video right here. And then also during your class period, there should be a Zoom link, an announcement sent to you, and that way you can meet up and ask questions after you do the lab, but try to do your lab before the Zoom meeting, or don't save it all for the Zoom meeting because you may not be able to finish it by then. Once you do that, everything will be due by 9 p.m. And for the most part, you're also going to have quizzes every week as well. So, the important thing to remember is that the attendance policy is pretty strict in Intro to Geology. So you can miss 2 classes, and for them to be excused and for the count is not missed, you need to have some sort of official note from an employer or a doctor. It can't be something like you overslept. So make sure to only miss 2 classes, otherwise you get 10 points taken off every time you skip, and that doesn't include the zeros you'll get on your quizzes and homework as well. So as far as grading goes, the class is going to be on a 10-point scale, and you're going to be graded 30% on your quizzes, 30% on your labs, 30% on your midterm, and then there's going to be 10% on a final presentation at the end of the course. Something to note is that your worst quiz is going to get dropped, so I wouldn't take that as a fail-safe. Usually people come into the lab and the first quiz usually surprises them, or the first identification quiz. But just so you know, your first quiz will get dropped. Yeah, so you should have watched a safety video. Generally, just make sure that you don't drink anything in the lab. You have to keep all your water bottles and stuff out of sight, otherwise we'll get in trouble as TAs and I guess the department. And then also make sure to wear closed-toed shoes. Technically, you're not allowed to wear sandals or anything into the lab. Alright, so with that out of the way, if you have any questions, including with how to do assignments or what's going on in the lab, feel free to email me at my email, and I guess I'll put it in the description. So, for getting into Intro to Geology, just make sure that you have your mineral identification kits and your rock boxes, and before class starts next week, make sure to check to see if all your rocks are in your rock boxes, because they could be missing. You never know what the bookstore is doing. So if you have any problems, email Dr. Colson, who runs the whole course, and he can fix that, or you can work with that with him. So, alright, so let's get started into the Intro to Geology Mineral Identification lecture. Oh yeah, so if you have any questions about the lab, format of the class, or anything, email me, and I'll put my email in the description, and it'll be in our Canvas announcements. But yeah, if you can email me, that would work a little bit better than Canvas messaging. So let's get started. Welcome to Intro to Geology. I know some of you probably are just taking this lab because you need the science electives, and maybe some of you are not exactly sure what you want to do yet, or some of you might already be almost all the way through your college career. But my goal with the lab really is just I understand if you don't like geology, but I'm just trying to make it a little bit more exciting. So when I came to college personally, now I'm a graduate student. I'm getting my hydrogeology master's at Clemson. But when I came to college, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, and I ended up liking geology because it's a nice mix of not too much math. You have to do a lot of math still, and engineering. So I've gotten to do a lot of cool jobs. I've worked doing mineral processing. So I got to set up plants to process minerals and exploratory studies for mines. And then on the other side of geology, there's also environmental geology. So I've got to study contaminants and how they travel through the ground. So one of the projects I did is certain clays will absorb pharmaceuticals that will travel out of your toilet into the ground and eventually into rivers, and those will affect wildlife and people. So you can be on the environmental side, working with mining, or you can be on the mining side, or you can be on the environmental side, and that's a whole nother thing. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with geology, and it's funny to say is that geology is also almost equal entry salary as engineering. So if you end up not liking engineering, maybe geology is a good choice for you because you get to be a little more hands-on, and maybe you don't have to do as much math. So to get started with our topic, what defines a mineral? So there's a difference between minerals and rocks. You don't really need to know it, but a rock is just kind of a conglomerate of minerals or something. A mineral, though, has a specific definition. There's 5 things that define a mineral, and you're going to need to know it for a quiz, and it's going to be a trick question all the time. So just make sure you know this one. So a mineral has to be naturally occurring, inorganic, have a crystalline structure, it has to be solid, and it has to have a known chemical makeup. So let's get on an example with that. So naturally occurring, a good example of all these things is ice. So ice is, well, not this ice cube from the refrigerator, but ice is naturally occurring, right? And it is also inorganic. So what defines inorganic is it's not made up of DNA or some sort of animal or plant. So a good example of a rock that's not a mineral is coal. Coal is not a mineral because it is organic. So ice, let's keep on going. Naturally occurring, inorganic, and has a crystalline structure. You know, snowflakes, you can kind of predict how they're going to form. Ice is solid. All minerals are solid, although this one should be easy to remember. And then they all have a fixed chemical makeup. So we know exactly what ice is made out of, H2O, and that's always going to stay the same. So ice is a good example of the 5 properties that define a mineral. Moving on, something that people usually mix up, we have defining minerals and then we have identifying minerals. So now we're going to go into properties that identify a mineral, which is different than define. And remember this because that is also another trick question in the quizzes. First 3 things people usually look at when they identify a mineral is color, hardness, and then the streak. So color, here we have a green rock. Here we have a pink rock, right? It's pretty obvious. Well, the reality with this is that color is a terrible identifier of almost every rock. So any rock can be almost any color depending on what elements happen to be in it, just contaminating it a little bit. So try not to use color to identify rocks, although you're gonna have to describe it in your lab. The next thing is hardness. Good way to think of hardness is what will scratch what, not what will break what. So like this rock is softer than my watch. It could still break my watch if I slammed it into it. But the idea is it is soft enough so it won't scratch the screen. You're going to be testing your rocks in a similar manner. And a good way to tell is you'll be having these rocks, and you'll have a plate, and something will scratch against something else. It'll be pretty obvious which one is being powdered and which one is not. And that goes on to our third identification that we're going to talk about. So we just did color, and we just did hardness. Now we're going on to streak. Streak is just what the rock leaves behind in that powdered form. So here we have a rock that's basically ceramic, kind of like your test plates you're going to use later. I'll go over that in a second. This rock streaks onto this rock and it leaves a black streak. Different rocks sometimes leave unusual streak colors. So like a silver rock, hematite, actually leaves a red streak on the plates. Moving on, we got the Mohs hardness scale. So the Mohs hardness scale is what's used to define exactly how hard something is in terms of hardness. The scale goes from 1 to 10, and the bottom is something really soft like talcum powder, something your fingernail could scratch definitionally, and it goes all the way up to the 10. The 10 is a diamond, as you'd expect. And in between there's a large range that we'll be able to test for. So like a good example is this gypsum I used earlier on my watch.
it's really soft. You can scratch it with your fingernails. And you look at that chart, and you can see that your fingernail is a 2.5. So you know that this rock is somewhere less than 2.5. And that's all you really need to know for now. I'll go over it in more detail later on how you can methodically test that. Other things like metal are right around a 7, right? So if you look at the chart, a knife is maybe somewhere around 5.5, and then a steel nail, something that's hardened like a drill bit, can go all the way to like 8. So you think about that, your keys could scratch your phone. It just depends on your keys and what type of metal they're made out of. And then you'll find this relatable. Your phone screens used to be made out of glass, which is right around, you look at that scale, right around 7. But these days they're made out of a mixture of glass and sometimes sapphire, which is also known as corundum, looking at that scale again. And corundum's right around a 9, and your quartz is around a 7. And if you'll notice, that means that your screen won't get scratched by metal anymore. So that's where the hardness scale applies. Going on, kind of related to screens, we have our transparency. So transparency is something you'll just be writing down. It's not typically used to identify rocks too much, but it is helpful. So the 3 types of transparencies. You have translucent, transparent, and opaque. I think most of you know what opaque is. Opaque is just something that lights can't pass through. Now the other 2, transparent and translucent, are pretty easy to mix up. So transparent, it's apparent what you can see through them. I just made that up. I'm pretty happy about that. So a good example is glass. Glass is transparent because you can see through it. This bottle of hand sanitizer, I guess you could say it's transparent because you can see what's on the other side when you look through it. A good example of translucent, let's see. So translucent means that light passes through it, but you can't see through it. So a good example is, you see this rock. When I put a light up to it, you can see the light going through it. So this rock is translucent. You might want to say it's opaque because to the eye it looks just like a solid rock, but the light does pass through it. Another example of that is your thumb. Your skin is translucent. It's not transparent. It isn't apparent what's on the other side of it. All right. And then the final topic, this one's actually pretty important for identifying a mineral, but it's very vague. So it's called luster. Luster is kind of the shine a surface gives off. So a good example is you have a metallic luster, and then you have a greasy luster and a resinous luster. To go on to this, this gypsum, it has a dull luster, you could say that, because there's no light reflecting off of it. And then a resinous means plastic. This coal kind of has a resinous luster. It's kind of like light bouncing off a piece of plastic. And then you can kind of imagine what a metallic luster would be. That's something that just looks like metal. Then it gets really vague in the definitions. Sometimes you have a greasy luster, which is, it's something that looks greasy. And then this one is a good example. So this is typically described as a resinous luster. It looks metallic, but this isn't actually metal, and you know it when you see it. So just remember, people want to say a lot of things are metallic. When in doubt, just say it's resinous. Some of the other topics we have. All right, so one of my favorite identifiers for what a mineral is its effervescence. Does it effervesce or not? The more simple way to say this is, does it bubble when you put acid on it or drop acid on it? So you put the acid onto this rock, right? You don't know what it is. This is a good test. Make sure to do this when you're trying to identify something in the midterm. So you're putting acid onto this rock and it bubbles. This is because the acid is dissolving the calcium in the rock, the calcium carbonate. This is a lot like how your teeth dissolve when you drink a soda with acid in it. It's the exact same process. So just keep that in mind, that calcite is made out of dissolved shells of organisms, and then when you put acid on it, it fizzes, kind of like how your teeth dissolves in acid. This is a great test, and as soon as it fizzes, you'll know exactly what it is. The next two identifiers of minerals are a little bit more, I wouldn't say esoteric, they're not very clear. So I'll try to give some good examples. So we have crystal form, and then we have cleavage. Crystal form is the way the rock grows. So you see this quartz grows into these nice little hexagonal shapes. That's the crystal form, that's how it grows. The rock boxes that you're going to be using in class, the rocks are so small, they're always broken, so you're almost going to never see the crystal form, also known as the growth habit. So yeah, so you have this hexagonal crystal form. Now on the other side of things, we have the breakage pattern, the fracture pattern, more known as the cleavage, which what you'll be asked. So the cleavage of quartz, so it has a hexagonal growth pattern, but the cleavage of quartz, it's called conchoidal. Conchoidal is just a fancy word for, it kind of breaks like glass, and it doesn't have any planes that it breaks in. So the big idea behind cleavage is that you have planes where a rock breaks smoothly. It's like a great example of that is you got some of this muscovite. A lot of people, you know it as mica. And mica cleaves perfectly in one direction, right? You get this little sheet. That's one cleavage plane. And a rock can have multiple cleavage planes, and you're going to have to tell me in the quizzes how many cleavage planes they have. So just so you remember, it's how the rock breaks, and it's when it makes a flat surface. Usually a good way to identify it is these cleavage planes reflect in the light. If the rock doesn't really have a clear cleavage plane, kind of like, say, this rock, or a good example is this one, right? It just kind of looks like a broken rock. You can just say it's fractured on your sheets. Yeah, so just remember the crystal growth pattern you're almost going to never see, but the cleavage pattern is how it breaks. I'll go over more examples of this in class, but this is an example of a perfect cleavage pattern in one plane, so it's one plane of cleavage. And that's how you'd answer it. So the other identifying factors you have for rocks are there's a lot of unusual small ones that you won't be having to list in your notebooks. These will be under the other classification they identify these rocks. So some rocks, I don't really have one here, are magnetic. So just make sure to test the rocks for magnetism. A good example of a magnetic rock is magnetite. So just remember that for a quiz. Some of them have a taste, like halite, fancy word for salt. Yeah, halite has a salty taste. And then one of the harder ways to identify feldspars is if they have twinning or striations. Twinning and striations are generally just very hard to see. I'll put up a picture and kind of try to point it out. So that's an example of twinning. And then here we have an example of striations, which is also pretty hard to see. So those are the others. Not all minerals have these striations, magnetism, or taste, but some of them do, and it's a pretty big giveaway to what they are. So that's kind of the intro into minerals and how to identify them. Next class, you're going to just go through the lab and try to identify these minerals. I'll talk a little bit more about it on the Zoom, and if you need any help, feel free to email me before your lab is due at 9 p.m. So remember, next week, you're going to be doing these labs. They'll be due at 9 p.m., but we're going to have a Zoom meeting during the period of that lab, and then also there'll be a little video released in the morning the day of that lab. Make sure to email Dr. Colson or me, and put the email in the description if you have any questions. And yeah, thanks.